Billionaire harasses black maid. What she does next is shocking. Sarah had never imagined her life would lead her to working in such a grand mansion. The house stood proudly, tucked away behind tall gates and hidden among the lush greenery of the estate. It was a place of luxury, a place that spoke of wealth and elegance. From the outside, it looked perfect, but behind its walls, there were stories waiting to be told. When Sarah first applied for the job as a maid in the mansion of Henry Delacroix, the billionaire businessman, she didn't expect much. She was simply looking for a steady job that could pay the bills. After moving from a small town, she hoped that the new city would bring her better opportunities. Henry's offer seemed like a golden chance to improve her life. Sarah had always been a hard worker. She had grown up in a modest family where work ethic was instilled in her from a young age. Cleaning homes and taking care of things wasn't new to her, but she had never worked in such a large, luxurious place. The mansion was unlike anything she had ever seen. The polished floors gleamed under the chandeliers that sparkled as though they were made of stars. The walls were adorned with expensive paintings, and the furniture was made of the finest wood. It was a world far removed from her own, yet it felt like she could belong. When she first met Henry, he had been charming. He introduced himself with a smile, his well-tailored suit making him look every bit the part of a successful businessman. He was older than her, but his charisma was magnetic. At first, Sarah thought he was just another wealthy man, but she soon realized that he was different. He didn't just talk about his success, he made you feel it. Henry Delacroix had a presence, one that made people respect him, even fear him at times. Sarah did her best to stay focused on her work. She had been hired to maintain the house, clean the rooms, wash the floors, and handle the laundry. It was a job she knew well, and she did it with pride. She knew that her work was important. After all, this mansion needed to be spotless every single day. But as the days passed, she started to notice little things that didn't feel quite right. It began with the way Henry would look at her. It wasn't the typical professional glance. Sometimes she would catch him staring at her a little too long, his eyes lingering as if he was inspecting her. Sarah brushed it off at first, thinking it was nothing more than a passing thought. After all, he was her employer and she needed this job. She couldn't afford to overthink things. But then the comments started. Henry would often make small talk with her when she was working, offering compliments on her cleaning skills or the way she kept the house looking immaculate. His words sounded innocent enough, but there was always an edge to them. At times, he would say things like, "You're much too beautiful to be cleaning these floors." Other times, he would smile in a way that made Sarah feel uncomfortable, even though he meant no harm. She wasn't used to such attention, and it left her feeling uneasy. Still, she kept her head down and continued with her work. After all, she couldn't afford to lose the job. The paycheck was too important, and she had her family to think about. So Sarah silently ignored the comments and tried to focus on the tasks at hand. But things were starting to shift in a way that she couldn't ignore. One evening, after she had finished her cleaning duties for the day, Henry asked her to stay back for a moment. She was hesitant at first, but agreed, thinking that maybe there was something more he needed done. The mansion was quiet, and the only sound in the air was the faint hum of the air conditioning. As she stepped into the room, she noticed that Henry was seated comfortably on one of the plush couches, a glass of wine in his hand. "Sarah," he began, his voice smooth, "you're always so diligent with your work. It's hard to find someone who cares about what they do these days." Sarah nodded, not sure where the conversation was going. "Thank you, sir. I just do my job." Henry leaned forward slightly, his gaze intense. "Well, I've been thinking you're more than just a maid. You're smart, you're capable. I can see that in the way you handle yourself. Have you ever considered doing something more with your life? Something more than just cleaning for people like me?" His words caught Sarah off guard. She wasn't sure what he meant by that. It was flattering, but at the same time, it felt almost like an invitation to something she wasn't ready for. She tried to keep the conversation light. "I'm just happy doing what I do," she replied politely. "I'm grateful for the opportunity." Henry smiled, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. "I think you could do more, I really do. Maybe I could help you." Sarah's heart skipped a beat, but she remained calm. She could feel the tension building, like a storm was about to break, but she wasn't sure how to stop it. Over the following weeks, Sarah's unease grew. The comments became more frequent, more pointed. Henry would often stop by her cleaning duties to ask about her life, to comment on her appearance, or to joke about her working so hard in such a beautiful place. She began to feel like she was being scrutinized, as though she were an object for his amusement rather than a professional doing her job. There were times when Sarah found herself avoiding him, retreating to the other side of the mansion just to escape his gaze. One afternoon, while Sarah was cleaning the study, Henry entered the room unexpectedly. She hadn't heard him approach, and she froze when she saw him standing there in the doorway. "I always enjoy watching you work," he said, his tone casual, but there was something else in his eyes. Sarah didn't know how to respond. She felt trapped, as though there were no escape from his presence. She had heard stories about men like him, men who thought their wealth could make them untouchable. But Sarah wasn't like the others who had come and gone from the mansion. She was determined to keep her dignity, to keep her job. But each day, it was becoming harder and harder to ignore the discomfort that was growing inside her. As much as she tried to stay focused on her work, the situation began to weigh on her. She wasn't sure what to do. She knew she had to be careful, that one wrong move could cost her the job she so desperately needed. But the more Henry watched her, the more it felt like she was losing control of the situation. It was a feeling Sarah had never experienced before, the feeling of being watched, of being reduced to something less than a person. One night, as Sarah lay in bed after a long day's work, she couldn't shake the thought that had been plaguing her for weeks. What if she was stuck? What if this was her life now? She had always prided herself on her independence, her ability to stand on her own 2 feet. But now it felt as though everything was slipping through her fingers. She had to do something. But what? What could she do? She wasn't sure, but she knew she couldn't keep living this way. She had to take control of her life again, somehow. The weeks that followed began to blur together for Sarah. Her daily routine in the mansion had become predictable. Wake up early, clean the vast rooms of the house, maintain the gleaming floors, and cook meals for Henry when needed. At first, she'd thought of her work as just another job, a stepping stone toward a better future. But now it felt more like a cage she couldn't escape from, a place where every day added to the mounting pressure inside her chest. Henry's behavior was growing harder to ignore. His comments, at first seemingly harmless, had now taken on a more personal tone. He would compliment her often, but the compliments were no longer about her work. They were about her appearance, the way she carried herself, the way she smiled. His attention became more frequent, and Sarah began to feel his eyes on her, whether she was dusting the shelves or scrubbing the floors. It was uncomfortable, like being under a spotlight she never asked for. Sarah tried to stay professional. She kept her head down and focused on her tasks. It wasn't easy, especially when Henry would interrupt her in the middle of cleaning to ask her questions about her life. He would often ask where she grew up, what her dreams were, or what she thought about the life she had now. She answered politely, but inside, she started to feel like these conversations were no longer about getting to know her. They were more about drawing her in, making her feel seen in a way that wasn't entirely welcome. One evening, after Sarah had spent hours cleaning the floors and polishing the windows, she was finally ready to leave for the day. It had been another long shift, and her tired body was aching from bending and scrubbing. As she grabbed her bag ready to head out, she bumped into Henry in the hallway. He was leaning casually against the wall, a glass of wine in his hand, as he always did in the evenings. "Sarah, you're always working so hard," he said with a soft smile, his tone warm but with an edge that made her uncomfortable. "Don't you ever take time for yourself?" She forced a smile, trying to keep her composure. "I do what I can. It's important to keep the house in good shape." Henry's smile deepened, and he took a small step closer. "Well, you deserve more than just being a maid, you know. You're far too intelligent and capable for this kind of work. You could do anything if you wanted." His words lingered in the air, and for the first time, Sarah felt a little nervous. She had heard similar things before from people who didn't understand why she worked so hard, why she chose this life. But something about Henry's words felt different. He wasn't offering help or guidance. It felt more like an observation, a judgment of her choices. "I'm happy with my work," she replied, her voice steady despite the tightness she felt in her chest. She had to make it clear that she wasn't interested in his opinions about her life. Henry paused, his expression thoughtful. "Are you really? Or are you just saying that because it's easier than facing the truth? You know, you could have more if you just let me help you." Sarah's stomach turned. There was something off about the way he said it. It wasn't just a casual offer of help, it felt like a challenge, as if he were testing her to see how far he could push. She didn't know what to make of it. "Thank you, but I'm doing fine," she said, her tone more firm than before. She wanted to end the conversation. It was clear that Henry was trying to cross a line, but she wasn't going to let him. She turned to walk away, but his voice stopped her. "Wait, Sarah," he said, and his voice had lost the friendly warmth it once carried. There was something else in it now, something that made her pause. She turned back, not sure what to expect. "Yes." Henry stood up straight, his gaze shifting slightly. He took a slow sip of his wine before speaking again. "I just think you could have everything you ever wanted. All it takes is saying yes." His voice was lower now, more persuasive. "I could give you the life you've always dreamed of if you just trust me." Sarah's heart raced. She felt a shiver run down her spine. Something about the way Henry spoke to her made her uneasy. It wasn't the offer of a better life, it was the implication behind it. She didn't know what he meant by everything, but she had a feeling it wasn't just about money or status. There was something else he wanted from her. She quickly glanced at her watch. "I'm sorry, but I really need to go," she said, cutting the conversation short before it could go any further. Henry didn't try to stop her this time. He simply nodded, his expression unreadable. "Of course, but think about what I said. You don't have to do this on your own." Without saying another word, Sarah hurried out of the mansion, her thoughts racing. She was shaken by the conversation. It wasn't just the words he had said, it was the way he said them. He had made it clear that he saw her as something more than a maid, but it wasn't in a respectful way. She wasn't sure what he wanted from her, but she didn't want to find out. The next day, Sarah tried to act normal, but the weight of the previous night's encounter hung over her. Henry's words echoed in her mind. "You could have everything you've always wanted." She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more behind them than just a casual offer of help. She began to wonder if she was being tested in some way, if she were expected to respond in a certain manner. The tension between them grew, but Sarah did her best to remain focused on her work. She wasn't going to let Henry control her life. She couldn't. But with every passing day, it became harder to ignore the growing discomfort that seemed to follow her every time she entered the mansion. Things got worse the following week. Sarah had been cleaning the grand staircase when Henry appeared again. This time there was no wine in his hand, no casual remarks about her work. Instead, he simply watched her for a moment, his gaze unwavering. "I hope you know," he said slowly, "that I'm only trying to help you. I see a lot of potential in you, Sarah. And I'd like to offer you more. Don't think of it as a favor. Think of it as an opportunity. Opportunities like these don't come around often." Sarah felt a cold knot form in her stomach. She knew exactly what he meant, but she wasn't going to play along. "I appreciate your offer, but I'm fine where I am," she replied, keeping her voice steady despite the anger and frustration rising inside her. She wanted to scream to tell him to stop crossing boundaries, but instead she forced a smile. Henry looked at her for a moment longer, as though he were trying to decide whether she was worth pursuing further. Finally, he nodded and walked away, but not before giving her one last, lingering look that made her skin crawl. Sarah took a deep breath and returned to her cleaning, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. Henry's offers, his words, they weren't just empty gestures. They were part of a larger game, one that she didn't want to be a part of. But she didn't know how to escape. She needed this job, but the longer she stayed, the more she feared what might happen next. Sarah could no longer deny the tension that had been building between her and Henry. Every day felt like she was walking a tightrope, trying to balance her need to keep the job and the increasing discomfort of being under his watchful eye. It wasn't just the comments anymore. It was the way he seemed to appear out of nowhere, as though he was always looking for an excuse to engage with her. Sometimes, it felt like he was waiting for her to do something, something he wanted her to do, although she wasn't sure what that was. At night, Sarah would lie awake, unable to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The mansion, with its tall ceilings and quiet halls, became a place where she felt more alone than ever. The vast spaces that should have felt luxurious instead made her feel small, almost invisible. But she wasn't invisible to Henry. She couldn't deny that anymore. One evening, after finishing her duties for the day, Sarah decided to take a walk outside to clear her head. The mansion grounds were peaceful, with the sounds of birds chirping in the distance and the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. It was a quiet place, far from the bustling city, and it gave her a moment of calm amidst the chaos inside her mind. She didn't want to think about Henry. She didn't want to think about the growing unease she felt in her chest every time he spoke to her. As she walked along the path, Sarah tried to push the thoughts aside. She was just a maid, after all. She had been hired to do a job, and she was good at it. Why was it so hard to keep things professional? Why did she feel like she was constantly being pulled into something she didn't want to be a part of? But then, as she walked past a row of tall trees, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned quickly, her heart skipping a beat. It was Henry. "Sarah," he called out softly, a hint of amusement in his voice. "You always work so hard. I thought I'd find you out here trying to get some peace." Sarah forced a smile, feeling her stomach tighten. "I just needed a moment to think," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. She didn't want to seem uncomfortable, but she couldn't help it. Every time Henry approached her, it felt like the ground beneath her feet was shifting. Henry smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I understand. You're always so diligent, always working, always striving for perfection. But you deserve more, Sarah. You know that, don't you?" Sarah swallowed hard. She had heard these words before, but this time they felt different. He was pushing again like he always did. He wasn't just admiring her work anymore. He was making it personal. "I'm fine," she said quickly. "I'm just doing my job." Henry's smile faded, and for the first time, Sarah saw something else in his eyes. It was almost as if he was disappointed in her response, as though she had let him down. The air between them grew thick with tension. "You could have more, you know," he said slowly, his voice quieter now. "More than this, more than just cleaning up after people." Sarah felt a knot tighten in her chest. She wasn't sure how to respond. Every part of her wanted to walk away, to end this conversation before it could go any further. But she didn't want to seem rude. She didn't want to lose the job. "I'm happy with my work," Sarah said, her voice shaking slightly despite her best efforts to remain calm. "I don't need anything more." Henry studied her for a moment, as though he were weighing her words carefully. Then he took a step closer to her, and for the first time, Sarah could smell the faint scent of his cologne. It made her feel trapped, like she couldn't breathe. "I think you're selling yourself short," Henry said softly. "You have so much potential, Sarah. Don't waste it on something like this." His words sent a chill down her spine. She wanted to tell him that she wasn't interested in anything he had to offer, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she nodded quickly, her eyes lowered to the ground. She didn't want to look at him anymore. She didn't want to see that look in his eyes, the one that made her feel like she was some kind of project, something to be fixed or molded into what he wanted. Henry didn't say anything more. He simply watched her for a moment before turning and walking away. Sarah stood there for a few seconds, trying to steady her breath. What had just happened? It was as if he had thrown everything she had worked so hard for into question, as if her role in his mansion wasn't enough. The truth was, Sarah had always been ambitious. She had always wanted more for herself. But this wasn't how she imagined it happening. She didn't want to feel like she owed someone her future just because they had more money or power than she did. The next few days were filled with a growing sense of dread. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Henry was watching her more closely now, waiting for her to make a move, waiting for her to change her mind. She had never been one to give in to pressure, but this was different. Henry had a way of making her feel like she had no choice, like there was only one path forward, the one he was offering. And yet, she resisted. Every time Henry spoke to her, every time he asked if she was sure about her future, she felt the weight of his words pulling at her. But she wasn't going to let him win. She couldn't let him dictate her life. This job might be hard, but it was hers, and she had earned it. She didn't want to give it up, not for anyone. She had worked too hard to let someone like Henry take that away from her. One afternoon, as Sarah was cleaning the library, she heard footsteps again. She turned to find Henry standing in the doorway, watching her as she dusted the bookshelves. This time, there was something different in his expression. It wasn't the usual casual smile or the faint look of amusement. It was something more serious, something more intense. "Sarah," he began, his tone softer than usual, "I need to talk to you about something important." Sarah froze. She didn't want to engage, but she also didn't want to seem rude. She placed the cloth she had been using on the table and turned to face him. "I'm listening," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Henry stepped closer, his eyes meeting hers. "I know you're a smart woman, Sarah. You know that I've offered you opportunities before. But this time, it's different. I'm offering you a chance to be more than just a maid. You could have a future here with me in a way that you can't even imagine." Sarah's heart started to race. She had heard enough. She could see where this was going, and she wasn't interested. She wasn't going to let Henry's words sway her. "I'm not looking for anything more," she said firmly, trying to make her voice sound confident. "I don't need your help. I'm fine on my own." Henry looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing her words. Then, without saying another word, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving Sarah standing there, her heart pounding in her chest. She had made herself clear. She wasn't going to let him manipulate her. She wasn't going to give in. But deep down, she knew it wasn't over. Henry wouldn't give up so easily. And neither would she. As Sarah entered the mansion the following morning, the weight of the past few days hung over her like a dark cloud. She couldn't shake the image of Henry's face, the way he had looked at her, like she was a project waiting to be molded into something else. The tension had grown to a point where she no longer felt at ease in the grand halls of the house. It was supposed to be a place of work, of routine, but now it felt like a place where every corner hid a challenge, a test she hadn't agreed to take. She went about her duties, cleaning the rooms, scrubbing the floors, wiping down the grand piano in the living room. But her thoughts kept drifting back to the conversation she had with Henry. It wasn't just his words that troubled her, it was the way he seemed to believe that he had the power to shape her life, that he could offer her a better future, that somehow her own dreams and ambitions weren't enough. She had always been proud of her independence. Sarah had worked hard for everything she had. She had left her small town and moved to the city in search of a better life. She hadn't imagined that she'd find herself in a mansion, but she was there, making a living and doing the work she was good at. She wasn't in it for the money or the grandeur. She was in it for herself, to prove to herself that she could stand on her own 2 feet. But Henry's words had shaken that belief. His insistence that she needed more, that she could do more, had made her question everything she thought she knew about herself. Maybe he was right. Maybe she could be doing more, living more, but not like this, not by relying on him. She wasn't going to let herself become just another person who owed their future to someone with more power. That evening, as Sarah finished up her cleaning for the day, Henry appeared again. She could hear his footsteps echoing through the hall as he approached, and she felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had been dreading this moment. He had been persistent, always finding ways to speak with her, always trying to get her to reconsider her place in the world. She didn't want to be a part of his game anymore. "Sarah," Henry said, his voice warm but with a hint of something else. "I've been thinking about our conversation." She didn't respond immediately, keeping her focus on the cloth in her hands. She didn't want to engage with him, didn't want to show any sign that his words had affected her. But she couldn't ignore him, not without causing a scene. "I've been thinking about what you said too," Sarah said, her voice steady, though inside she felt a flutter of anxiety. She could feel his gaze on her, studying her as if trying to figure out her next move. Henry took a step closer, his presence heavy in the air. "I understand that you might be hesitant. I've seen it before, you know. People are afraid to take a chance, afraid to change. But you don't have to do this alone. I can help you, Sarah." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. There it was again, the offer, the promise of something more. But this time it felt different. It wasn't just about a better job or a better life anymore. It felt like Henry was pushing her into something she didn't want. "I don't need your help," she said, the words coming out more forcefully than she intended. She quickly added, "I've worked hard to get where I am. I'm not looking for anything else." Henry seemed unfazed by her rejection. Instead, he stepped closer again, his voice softer now. "You're still not seeing it, are you? You don't have to keep struggling. You don't have to keep working so hard just to make ends meet. There's a way for you to live the life you deserve." The words hung in the air, and Sarah felt a surge of frustration building inside her. It wasn't about what he thought she deserved. It was about what she wanted, what she had worked for. She didn't need him to fix her life. She didn't need his charity, his power, or his influence. "I'm not asking for anything more than this," she said, her tone unwavering. "This job, this life is enough for me. I don't need you to offer me something else. I'm happy with who I am and where I'm at." Henry looked at her for a long time, his eyes searching hers, as if trying to figure out if she was telling the truth. Finally, he sighed and took a step back. "Okay," he said, the smile on his face now replaced by something more calculating. "If that's what you want, I won't push any further, but don't think this is the end of the conversation. We'll talk again, Sarah. You'll see that I'm right." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Sarah standing alone in the hallway. She felt a mixture of relief and unease. On the one hand, she was glad that he hadn't pushed her further. On the other, she knew that this wasn't the end. Henry didn't give up that easily. The next few days were filled with an uneasy calm. Sarah went about her work as usual, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. Henry had said it wasn't the end, and she believed him. One afternoon, a few days later, Sarah found herself cleaning the grand dining room when she noticed something out of the corner of her eye. Henry was standing by the doorway, watching her. She paused, her heart skipping a beat. She couldn't avoid him forever, but she wasn't sure if she was ready for another conversation like the last one. "You're always so focused, Sarah," Henry said, his voice light and casual. "It's impressive, really, but I hope you don't think you'll have to keep this up forever. You've worked so hard, it's time you take a step forward." Sarah felt a sharp edge to his words, but she refused to let him see how much they affected her. She was determined to stay strong. "I'm doing just fine, I don't need anything else." Henry didn't respond immediately, but Sarah could tell he wasn't finished. There was a silence between them, and in that silence, Sarah made a decision. She was done with this. She was done with Henry trying to manipulate her, trying to tell her what she needed. She wasn't going to let him control her life, not anymore. "I think I've made myself clear," she said, her voice steady and firm. "I don't want your offers, I don't need you to fix anything for me. I'm happy with what I have." Henry's face darkened for a brief moment before he regained his composure. "All right, Sarah," he said, his voice cold. "If that's how you feel, then I won't push you. But remember this, when the time comes and you realize what you've given up, I'll be here." He turned and walked away, and this time, Sarah didn't feel the knot of anxiety in her stomach. Instead, she felt a sense of clarity. She had made her decision. Henry couldn't change that. For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt a sense of freedom. She had stood up for herself, made it clear that she wouldn't be swayed. She was in control of her own life, and no one, not even Henry, could take that away from her. She had made it through the hardest part. Now it was time to move forward on her own terms. The days that followed felt different. There was a sense of quiet victory inside Sarah, a feeling that she had finally taken control of her own destiny. Henry had tried time and time again to manipulate her to make her feel as though she needed him. But Sarah knew better. She knew she didn't need his help, his offers, or his empty promises. She had proven that to herself, and that was enough. But even though she felt stronger, more in control, the tension between her and Henry lingered. She could feel it in the way he looked at her, the way he spoke to her with that undertone of expectation, as if he were waiting for her to change her mind. He didn't understand. He didn't understand that Sarah wasn't like the others he had worked with, the ones who had fallen for his charm and wealth. Sarah was different. She didn't need his approval, and she wasn't going to let him make her feel small or insignificant. It wasn't long before Sarah realized that something had changed in the mansion. There was a shift in the air, something subtle but undeniable. Henry seemed to have stopped pushing her, stopped trying to make her feel like she owed him something. He was still around, of course, but his presence wasn't as overwhelming as it had been. For a moment, Sarah wondered if he had finally given up, if he had realized that she wasn't going to bend to his will. She didn't know why, but she began to feel a little lighter. Perhaps it was because she no longer had to carry the weight of his expectations. Perhaps it was because she knew she had made the right choice. Whatever it was, Sarah began to feel like she could breathe again. She could focus on her work, her own goals, without the constant pressure of wondering when Henry would approach her with another offer, another demand. The next week, Sarah received a letter. It was a simple, elegant envelope with the mansion's letterhead on it. She stared at it for a moment, unsure of what to expect. She hadn't heard from Henry in days, and she hadn't been thinking about him much. Maybe it was a formality, a thank you for her hard work. She opened it carefully, unfolding the crisp paper inside. The letter was brief, but the words caught her off guard. It was from Henry's legal team. They had drafted a contract for her, not for more work, not for a promotion, but for something entirely different. The letter outlined a proposal to invest in her future, to help her with her education, her career, and her personal growth. It was an offer to provide a financial stipend to support her dreams and goals, in exchange for a long-term commitment to remain working in the mansion, to keep a certain level of loyalty to the family. Sarah read the letter several times, her heart pounding in her chest. She had always dreamed of going to college, of becoming something more than just a maid. But this wasn't what she had envisioned. This wasn't how she wanted to achieve her goals. She didn't want to owe anything to Henry, not after everything that had happened. She didn't want to be tied down by his generosity, no matter how tempting the offer might seem. As she sat at the kitchen table, the letter spread out before her, Sarah felt a mix of emotions. She was touched by the idea of someone investing in her future, but she wasn't sure she could accept it. She had worked too hard to get to where she was, and now, just when she had started to feel free, this offer threatened to pull her back into a situation where she would have to answer to someone else. She didn't want to be beholden to Henry, not after everything he had put her through. She folded the letter carefully, placing it in her bag. For the first time in weeks, she knew exactly what she had to do. She couldn't accept his offer. It was tempting, yes, but it wasn't the right path for her. She had learned that she could achieve her dreams on her own without anyone telling her what she needed to do. She could be independent, strong, and make her own way in the world. And that was what she was going to do. The next day, Sarah took the letter to Henry's office. She stood in front of the door for a moment, her heart racing before she knocked gently. When he called for her to come in, she opened the door and walked inside. Henry was sitting at his desk, his back to her as he flipped through some paperwork. He looked up when he heard her enter, his expression neutral. "Sarah," he said, his voice pleasant as though nothing had changed. "I see you got the letter." She nodded, her hands trembling slightly. "Yes, I did, and I wanted to talk to you about it." Henry leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I figured you'd have questions. It's a big offer after all, but I really believe this is a good opportunity for you." Sarah took a deep breath, standing tall. She wasn't going to let him intimidate her. She had made her decision, and there was no turning back now. "I appreciate the offer, Henry," she said, her voice steady, "but I can't accept it. I've worked too hard to get to where I am. I've built my life on my own, and I don't want to owe anything to anyone, least of all you. I want to be able to stand on my own without anyone holding anything over me." Henry didn't say anything for a moment, just stared at her as though weighing her words. Sarah held her ground, refusing to look away. Finally, he nodded as if he had expected her response. "I understand," he said softly. "You're a stubborn one, Sarah. I can respect that, but don't think that this is the last time I offer you help. You're smarter than most people give you credit for, and I'll be here if you change your mind." Sarah felt a sense of finality in his words, but she wasn't afraid. She had made her choice, and this time it felt right. "I won't change my mind," Sarah said firmly. "I know what I want, and it doesn't involve you or anyone else telling me how to live my life." Henry didn't respond immediately. Instead, he gave her a long look, as if he were trying to decide whether to argue further. But in the end, he just nodded, as if accepting her decision. "All right then, I wish you the best, Sarah." With that, Sarah turned and walked out of the office, the weight that had been hanging over her for so long finally lifting. She felt free, truly free. And for the first time in a long time, she knew that she could face whatever came next on her own terms. As Sarah walked out of the mansion that evening, the world seemed a little bit brighter. She knew that the future was uncertain, but she also knew that it was hers to shape. She had made it through the hardest part, and now it was time to focus on her dreams, dreams that were her own, not anyone else's. She was ready to move on, ready to take the next step, and nothing, not even Henry's offers, could stand in her way.